Well, I thought about a few topics and I figured I would go with the one that we've talked about most recently, my fascination with code culture. Because I found the Facebook post I'd written a few months ago again that had inspired you to reach out to me. And it took me a moment. I said, well, wait, why did I think this again? Oh, right, I remember. This is still interesting. Um, so I wanted to talk a little bit about version control in coding from the perspective of me, a historian, anthropologist who's now working in product management. So this has been an exploration for me, and there's still a lot that I need to explore. I haven't done too much exploration since we last spoke, but I thought you haven't heard about it in a while, and neither has the internet. So
Cool.
Yeah. So I think I just want to tell a little bit about how I came to this topic, because this was not something that I deliberately set out to study or unearth. In undergrad, I was a student of history. My degree is in history, so I get to say that. And then I also studied anthropology. And throughout my career, I became a tech manager at a web design firm, and then ended up running back to business school, and then found myself working at a nonprofit in San Francisco. The company's called Somasource, if anyone wants to look it up. And I am a product manager. And what's unique about the product that we have is it's used by individuals in developing regions in Africa and India. So there's a very social, cultural aspect to it as well. But that wasn't even what I found to be most interesting that I wanted to share with you. It was more working with engineers, which I'd never done before. In my past jobs, I worked with salespeople. I worked with advertising operations people who were doing things in Google Analytics. I'd worked with UX designers and visual designers and also front-end developers, but I'd never worked with full-stack engineers. And we use GitHub at my office, and I found a number of things really interesting about the way that my engineering team works and communicates with me, with themselves, as well as all of these other people on the internet who don't work for our company, who they're talking to all the time about what they're doing, namely other people on GitHub. And I'll just talk a little bit about what GitHub is and how I was introduced to it. I'm sure you know all of this, but it's version control for software. So what the engineers do is when they're writing their code, they check it into the website so that we have this very organized version history, like library books on a shelf, of every change they've made. The practical reason for that is if something goes wrong, we can wind back all of those versions and go back to the last one that was good. But version control existed for a long time before GitHub. In a way, that's not the big invention. That's not that interesting here to me. That's practical. But GitHub is it's not a social media platform, but it's a website, and that means that you can share what you're doing with everyone else. So I found it really fascinating that some of what we do is open source, and they're participating in the open source communities. And so not just at my office, but anyone, what they can do is participate in an open source project, and instead of the old school way of downloading the entire repository and then sending an email to someone who probably doesn't know them and waiting to hear if their patch would be incorporated into the main body of work, now you've got a profile on GitHub, you've got a resume, you have a reputation. And so if I were to communicate with someone and commit to an open source project, they could look at my profile and see who I am, and it's this reputation management piece. And so I found the communication of GitHub, as well as that version control aspect, to be really fascinating. And I've just been asking a lot of people pesky questions about it for months and trying to graft it onto my own understanding of history as a reconstruction of the past, and thinking about current code as a reconstruction of the history we want to remember and not the history that we don't.
Cool. This is really fascinating. I really love this topic, obviously, and so from your background in history and anthropology, what and this is fascinating. We can talk a lot more about, since you're kind of this ambassador to the tech world, having grown up in a very non-tech academic background. What are there analogies that you can imagine from your prior studies in other fields to this phenomenon of social version control and communities online and stuff? Can you draw analogies in history or anthropology from any of this?
A little bit. There's the famous expression that history is written by the victors. And the idea of rewriting history at first struck me as bad. I think of history as that reconstruction of the past. It's not just the historical record, but it's someone making an argument, making a claim of event A led to event B, led to event C, and here's how we should look back on everything. And so my first thought was, well, why wouldn't we want all of the versions? And I think in some repositories, they are kept as background knowledge, but they're not that one line coming up to the future. And so that was my first take. It's not a specific analogy, but I looked at version control and went, well, I understand why this is useful, but are we losing some information here? And how are those decisions being made? Who decides what version is going ultimately into the final product? And in a company like mine, we have different engineers working on different user stories. It's not that contentious, but I imagine on an open source project, and I would love to do more research into this, there might be two competing versions for the next version of a feature that's going to come out. And so I think, as in history, when a historian is sitting down, writing those facts and deciding what goes in the history book, perhaps someone who's managing an open source project is thinking, well, which version do I choose? And I wonder, are those decisions political? They're certainly social. They're people communicating with each other. Is it just a popularity contest? Hopefully they're evaluating what the feature actually does and looking for who wrote clean code that makes sense with the rest of the product. So I think that process of writing is what really struck me as a tie between writing code and writing history, or even just making history through the writing of documents, and thinking about coding in a more humanities type of lens than I had before.
Yeah, this is really super fascinating. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind was, there's a lot of these examples. The first thing that comes to mind in the JavaScript world, there's this big popular project called Node.js, which is a very popular web server in JavaScript. And they were developed by some organization. I think they're backed by a for-profit company or something, but then their development policies, I think, were too slow or conservative for some of the other members of the community. So then they actually forked the project, right? So you see these open source projects on GitHub forking and saying, okay, we're just going to take your code, since your license allows us to, it's all open source, we have the right license, we can make our own version, call something else, so we don't infringe any trademark. And then some people, I mean, you should read Wikipedia for all the definitive arguments about this, but some people forked it to this thing called like io.js or something. I don't remember the name. And they had these two parallel branches going, essentially the same project. And with the new forked project, they were able to develop faster or incorporate more features that the original project maintainers did not want to, perhaps due to their philosophy. And I think eventually they had a merge back. They had like this truce, and they're like, "Oh, we're going to merge back and call a truce and stuff." But there are many projects in the past, like even before GitHub, like in the 70s and 80s, with like the Emacs text editor, there was like this fork called Xemacs or something, and there's like a lot of these open source projects being forked off because their original creators' visions were different than what some new people wanted to do, and they're well within the rights to do it, because if your license says you can do it, you can do it. So I think there's a lot of that, and I think the thing that brought to mind is that, from my reading of a lot of this stuff, is I think on Wikipedia and on just blogs, you can probably get multiple perspectives on things. So perhaps for ancient history, you might only have one dominant perspective because things weren't well kept. But now everything's online, everything is versioned. It's very meta. You could actually read a lot more about these political battles and such. So yeah, so I would love to talk more about that, or your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, another thing that I think of is, so my office is hiring for a new engineer, and we of course wanted someone that is familiar with the language that we code in, but is also familiar in whatever else is popular on GitHub. And that struck a note with me. I thought, well, what is this popular on GitHub? Who decides what's popular on GitHub? How do we know what libraries will be ones that people decide to use? And so my other thought was that this critical mass of people who are on this website, who are able to have their reputations be public and communicate with each other to generate new knowledge, they're also generating what's popular. So in terms of what languages are chosen for new open source projects, I imagine that the majority of them, they have to be popular on GitHub, because that's how they'll be able to find people to work on them, people who are knowledgeable about the languages, just more documentation, public documentation of it. So the critical mass is dictating the next steps of technology in terms of languages, so it seems.
Yeah, that's a really good insight. I mean, it's awesome seeing your perspective as a non-engineer, right? Because software engineers talk about this a lot, but it's really cool that you bring this perspective.
I'm laughing because I'm sure some software engineers would be like, well, yeah, that's what I do every day. That's fun. Why is this interesting? But to me, it's like there are people sitting at home, probably not wearing pants, making history right now. making technology.
That's right.
By participating in this community, GitHub, I think, is described as owning the code graph as opposed to the social graph of a Twitter or Facebook. But by participating, by being active, by showing up and typing something, they are on what are the languages that will write the products of the next 10 years, of the next 20 years, and so on and so forth. And I think that's really fascinating that the barrier of entry is relatively low. I mean, sure, you need a computer, you need an internet connection, you need an education, you need verbal and communication skills. But there are many people who have those things, and hopefully as we expand internet connectivity into more rural regions, there will be more people who will be able to participate, given that the barriers can be really low. So I just think it's crazy that it's so easy to create that language of the future to some extent. You don't have to be in a hollowed white marble hall anymore.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that people are doing it a lot of times for free as well, right? There's this whole labor economics argument of, open source was this thing done by academics and university students and volunteers and hobbyists back in the old days, but now it's like, as you've observed, you're working at companies and being in San Francisco, it's become a foundation for a lot of huge, giant, profitable businesses. So that's another kind of, have you thought about this angle of the fact that GitHub is itself a for-profit startup company, and it's controlling the, you want it to be a good citizen, but it's potentially controlling all of this open kind of ecosystem. So, I mean, have you had thoughts about that? That's so centralized.
It's very risky. I would love to see GitHub manage, or a product like GitHub managed by, inter-country, non-governmental internet organization, of which there are many, and the names escape me right now.
Lots of acronyms,
but I don't, yeah. It's so profitable, though. I'm not sure that it ever will be. And I don't know too much about how their business works. I know they have job boards, and you have to pay quite a bit to have jobs posted there, as does Stack Overflow, which is, I think, actually what we used when we were looking for someone at work. And I assume they have advertisements. So I'm not 100% sure what their revenue stream comes from.
Well, they have private accounts. Yeah. Okay. I mean, they have for businesses. They have they have private repositories for businesses. And I think a lot of businesses use them to host, basically it's a cloud hosting service for your code.
Yeah, and we do have a private account for our core repository as well, so that makes sense. It does seem like there's a lot of power concentrated in the hands of a private company, and I am not so much concerned about the people that run GitHub. I think they know how good this is. I'd be more concerned about their investors, all the various VC companies who just want to make money. But of course, they are the ones facilitating a website like this, because GitHub is not public yet, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think so.
No, money is being pumped into that, and they're certainly not the only game in town for version control. There's a company based in Alameda, California called Perforce, and then there are older things like CVS. I don't know if anyone uses that anymore, but GitHub really, once you have a username on GitHub, I remember at work when they asked me to create one, I felt cool. I felt like I made it, even though I've done nothing with it except read my engineers' pull requests. But yeah, I'm thinking back to the comment that more recently sparked this train of thought that I had, that a friend of mine who's a UX designer said that he didn't think GitHub was cool or interesting. Or I think he said that he thought it was boring, except for open source. And I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense, because open source is really fascinating. And so I was thinking and trying to unpack, well, why do I think it's cool? And hopefully I've been able to highlight some of that, that aspect of rewriting history, version control in and of itself, but then the critical mass of all of these people on GitHub that are using that power to communicate with each other and aggregate into what is the next language of the future. And I wrote something on one of my little mini pieces of paper here. I was thinking, like, is this the anthropology of code, for one to study the evolution of the different languages? And people have done this. There was a great article in, was it Wired? No, it was Bloomberg Magazine. It was a giant cover story called What is Code last year that was excellent, that I'm sure you've read. I would recommend to anyone to read it. Written by an engineer who was able to go through, well, how do businesses work today? And why does this code stuff matter? But thinking about, so he kind of went through a great anthropology of the history of code, but I'm very interested in those decision points and why did we decide to go one way over another?
Hey, this is fascinating. And can you imagine, thinking about approaches in the social sciences, can you imagine interviewing people or talking to the people about these decisions? And do you feel like people will be open to talking about this? Or do you feel like at the rewriting history thing, maybe there are private sort of matters that people don't want to expose publicly, because the code is all public. Let's say an open source project, the code is all public there, and the version history is presumably mostly public, but maybe people's rationale, maybe they don't want to be as public about it. Maybe they actually want a way to talk about it more. Maybe you have ideas about how open people will be talking about that.
I think it's going to be a mix. I think like anything, I think there would be some individuals, particularly the ones whose solutions were successful, would probably be very open to it. Well, actually, maybe the ones that weren't successful would be more interested in saying, no, mine was better. And the ones who were successful would likely see it as non-contentious. I'm sure it would probably be echoes of your standard business history in which some companies say, oh, well, our product was clearly the best, therefore we succeeded, whereas others feel like they were squelched, in the climb to greatness. I also wonder how much of it is just lost, how many decisions were incidental. Somebody didn't send their code in and someone else did on a big project, or certain code ran faster on a certain new piece of hardware that wasn't necessarily designed for it. This is getting into some of the more technical efficiencies that I have yet to explore more, but I'm guessing that there are a lot of decisions that are not that interesting, as well as some that are very business oriented in terms of companies going out of business, companies getting bought by others, individuals moving between companies who worked near each other, as well as the internet becoming more and more widespread for the communication. So I think there's a story there. And yeah, certainly I hope to have the time someday to delve into it a bit more, because I really do see it as, well, history, of course, but that anthropological aspect of things are happening because certain people are communicating with each other and others aren't.
Yeah, this is really cool. There's a few books on this. There's this one book I read, this is like 10 years ago, called Dreaming in Code. It's called Dreaming in Code, and it's by a journalist, and he followed around this this open source, presumably open source project, but it was really just developed by a core group of people, and they kind of documented the 2 or 3 year journey of them. I forgot what they're trying to make. They're trying to make some like amazing email application off this productivity killer suite or whatever. And the lesson on that was that it was ultimately a failed project because of all these. They were trying to design too ambitiously, and they had too many policies, and they had infighting and stuff. So the stuff that you want to do sort of reminds me of that a little bit. Or there's just other kinds of blogs that people write about this kind of anthropology of programming. I think that's that's an awesome way. I think it's an awesome catchphrase for that. Yeah, so the anthropology of programming is I like that catchphrase. So, what are your next steps thinking about this? What would you like to do ideally if you had infinite time?
I think I'd like to be able to interview some individuals on a small team and study their group dynamics, purely because I'm interested in it. I think the fact that I was interested in it, even when that has not been my primary job at my day job, speaks to the fact that there's something there, at least for me. And I think when you and I spoke about this a couple months ago, you suggested going to GitHub and trying to find a smaller open source repository and looking at the actual commits to see, were there two that came in at the same time? Perhaps there was a decision of one versus another, and just seeing the evolutionary process of both projects through the commits, as well as over a longer time span, the languages. So I think what I'd like to do is try and study a small project and see if some of the ideas that I have about how this is happening also play out. And of course, there's my team at work. I probably shouldn't bother them too much because I want other things from them, like deadlines. But I think that's something that I would hope to do soon. And given that I'm in the Bay Area, there are likely people I could even meet with in person who are working on startups or in incubators that might find this interesting, and who knows, even PR for their own projects.
Yeah, this is all really cool. I mean, it's such a big source of data and people, right? That there are, ranging from kind of like the college students who now want to try to put their class projects and hackathon projects on GitHub to get publicity, right? To build a kind of online resume, to people at very established companies like Microsoft and Google who are working at Google and Microsoft, being paid, real salary at a real job, but their project happens to be in the open. So we have both extremes of student hobbyists and basically engineers at top companies, but they just happen to be on open source projects. And the cool thing about reading the GitHub commits and stuff is that you can do it all offline yourself. But then it also could be really esoteric and boring because most of the commits are probably super boring and stuff.
Yeah, there's probably not a lot of conversation, or, what I'm looking for is arguments. That's what I want to find.
Yeah, and I think on the arguments point, they have these comments and pull requests and stuff. So, there are, occasionally people posting online on news sites about like, oh, there's this epic argument about whether we should use tabs or spaces, or whether, some philosophical, difference. And like, I think like you mentioned before, a lot of the reasoning may be mundane, right? Like, this is the style we always do it, or we acquired another company and their engineer knows this library really well, and they have some old open source code they use for another application. So we're just going to dump it in and adapt it because, code is so hard to get right that if have someone who knows a specific library or language, let's just use it, even if it may not be the ideal pick. And
yeah. So I've heard code described in two ways. One as handwriting, that different individuals have different coding styles, like they have different handwriting styles. And some people also, not just handwriting, but the way they format it, coders as poets, writing stanzas. Some of them structure their code very nicely. They organize their notes very neatly. That can be, I've heard, a pleasure to read, and others don't. So that's kind of the elegant side of some code. And then I've also heard coders described as construction workers that are trying to put things together with duct tape and rubber cement. That they're just trying to take, old pieces of things. As you said, this guy knows this library. We already have this library written. Let's just repurpose it and put a patch on it so the round tube fits in the square hole and it works. So I think some of the decisions, are interesting, and others, it's, how can we get this done, meet the feature spec in the least amount of time for the least cost? Well, it's this one, and that has dictated the path of the project.
Yeah, this is super cool. I mean, we could talk for long about this other topic at another time, but this idea of code as craft or poetry or stanzas versus code as Legos and construction materials. And the one thought I had about this, which I want to get your thoughts on, is the fact that, writing production code, let's say at your company or at other companies, you may want stylistic policies or standards so that, you don't want someone making a Jackson Pollock painting on your code because you want something that works and other people can comprehend, but you don't want to stifle people's individuality as well. So how do you see that playing out in terms of this conflict between being a craftsperson and being an engineer, right, for lack of a better term?
I think one way we solve that at my company is by allowing the engineers to have 10% time where they can work on whatever they want. But I'm not sure that's a good answer, because that 10% has to then be able to go back into our code base. So it still follows the standard rules of, it has to be readable. It has to be communicatable to the next engineer who works at our company if you as an individual decide to leave. So I think we have a very small team. We only have 4 engineers. So there's enough communication there where one engineer does it, one of the other engineers reviews their pull request, and then the director looks at it. So then you've got 3/4 of the team already looking at it. I think in that case, we're asking them to be creative with their solution design. And I think we have a culture of creativity in writing succinct and clear code. And maybe that's just brainwashing. But your creativity should be channeled into that.
That's right. And I think the analogy that our writing or journalism is, the New York Times or the New Yorker or Washington Post has a house style, right? They have a house style, and kind of their editorial board really wants to keep this kind of punchy, journalistic, active voice style. So, you can write whatever you want, but you're kind of trained to write in this sort of very pithy style, and it's similar with code as well.
And I think that's when you're on staff at the paper, or when you're on staff for a company, when you are writing code on somebody else's time, on somebody else's dollar, there are some rules. And I think we do encourage our engineers, and I know a lot of other companies do, to do their own projects, do their own open source projects. These are things that individuals can often put on their resumes for getting their next job. That's how they move up in their careers. So I would encourage people to put their weird looking code that no one else wants to look at on the internet to find the other weirdos who want to look at it.
Yeah, or just weirdly indented things with like ASCII art in the code and everything.
I think that's amazing. I think it's, there's a time and place for that. And, as the product manager, my job is to say, but that, the coders as writers also goes back to this great respect that I have for engineers that I've always had, but coming into this job and being able to see how they work for their human skills, their writing skills, these things that I thought of traditionally as humanities skills that are very critical in the engineering space. These individuals who often pride themselves on math and quantitative approaches and not being emotional. That's kind of the stereotype of the engineer. most of them really do have all of these wonderful skills. You just have to draw it out of them a bit more. They're writers, they're poets, they're, thinkers in groups and teams, even if they say they're not. So I think it's just been wonderful for me to see the more human side of what makes a successful engineer and really what makes this whole Silicon Valley run. It's not just a bunch of nerds in basements. These are really talented business people and thinkers.
Yeah, and this is a good segue for wrapping up also of this idea that modern software development is a human and social and cultural process, whether it's on a large scale in GitHub or even within a company. Like it's really gone are the days of one person hunched over the computer with no pants making something great, right? That it's all, anything that is being used by people is mostly a team effort and stuff. So do you have parting thoughts or advice or words for someone who came from your sort of academic background, wanting to get more into the technical world and such? Because I think you've had a fascinating journey, and you've been able to talk super fluently and really well about this stuff. So,
well, thank you.
Parting thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's been enjoyable to talk to you as well, and thank you for inviting me to talk. My advice would be to not be afraid of computer science, the engineering world. I am not an engineer by training and do not code myself. I'd like to change that at some point soon, but especially for people that are in the throes of their education or not, that you could just go online on Code Academy and learn something. Learn the code. Don't be afraid of it. It has a beautiful logic to it, almost like it's like reading music or writing music. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. And so I would just engage with it, or take a tech job that you think might be a little bit out of your realm or that looks a little bit boring, because you may find the more humanities skills. I'm thinking of people who might more naturally be salespeople or PR reps or writers or fundraisers. A lot of those same skills are applicable. So don't fear the code, because I think that's what's made it more interesting in general, is people that have these broader interests coming into the field.
Awesome. That's an awesome note to end on. All right, we're going to go offline incognito for a few minutes.
All right.
Thanks, Audrey.
Thank you. Bye, Phil.